He once carried a weapon that wasn't a gun but a spray of poison. 50 years later, he carries only a cane and a bouquet of white flowers. This is the story of a soldier who returned to the river he had poisoned to face the survivors, to face himself, and to face the truth that rivers never forget. The war never truly ended for John Whitaker. It lived inside him in the hollows of his lungs, in the tremor of his hands, and most hauntingly, in the relentless memories that returned each night when sleep became thin and fragile. He was 20 years old when the sky first turned the color of ash, when the rotors of helicopters carved the air like monstrous blades. Now, more than 50 years later, those sounds were still etched in him sharper than any scar. In the darkness of his memory, the jungle burned in silence before it screamed. The leaves, once lush and thick, surrendered to a rain of chemicals that fell like a cruel blessing. Droplets coated his skin, seeped into his uniform, clung to his hair. He remembered the acrid sting at the back of his throat, the strange silence that followed as if the earth itself held its breath. Then came the coughing children, women, the elderly sounds that should never have blended with the cries of war. John had been ordered to spray the riverbanks to empty canisters of a substance he had not fully understood then. He followed instructions like all young men, eager to survive, blind to consequence. But there was one image that never left him, a boy no more than 10, standing barefoot at the edge of the river. The child's eyes were not filled with fear, but something worse, an ancient, unyielding sorrow, as if he had already seen too much. John raised his weapon of chemicals, the spray arching out across the water, and the boy did not move. He simply stood there silent, watching, condemning, without words. That boy had followed John home across an ocean, across decades. He lingered in nightmares, appeared in hospital corridors when John's own son was diagnosed with leukemia, and sat wordlessly at the edge of his bed during sleepless nights. No prayer, no whiskey, no doctor's reassurances could banish him. He was the living memory of everything John wished to forget. The years had not been kind. His lungs, scarred and fragile, carried the weight of every breath. Doctors in Virginia spoke in tones of inevitability, of time running thin, of treatments that could not erase what was buried deep within. John, now 72, realized he had lived in exile from the truth. He had never returned to the land that had claimed his youth and branded his conscience. Until now. The hum of the airplane engines brought him back to the present. He sat hunched in his seat, the overhead lights dimmed a bouquet of white flowers wrapped carefully in his carry-on bag. His hands shook when he reached for them, not from turbulence, but from the knowledge of what they represented. They were not an offering of apology. There could be no apology vast enough for what had been done. They were a gesture of remembrance, fragile and fleeting, like the men in his unit, like the villagers, like the years stolen from children not yet born. Outside the oval window, clouds shifted, and for a moment John imagined the faint outline of the coastline he had last seen in 1970. Then it had been through the haze of war, salt mixed with smoke, the scent of fear sharp in his nostrils. Now it was quiet, deceptively serene. The war had ended on paper long ago, but rivers remember what treaties forget. He closed his eyes and felt the heaviness of return pressing into him. The announcement over the speaker declared their descent into Hugh. His stomach knotted, not from the drop in altitude, but from the thought of stepping again on soil that held both his youth and his damnation. The airport was brighter. More alive than he could have imagined. Neon signs in 2 languages, children tugging on their parents' sleeves, young soldiers in crisp uniforms who could not have known what their elders endured. John moved slowly through the terminal, clutching his bag as though it held his very heart. Each step felt like trespass, as though he had no right to be among these people, no right to stand in a land where he had once rained poison. The taxi ride out of the city blurred past him. Motorbikes swarmed like schools of fish horns, bleating vendors shouting along the roadside. Yet beneath the noise, John heard other sounds, the echo of gunfire, the muffled cries in the night. He saw fields that had healed into green again, though he knew some wounds lay beneath the soil, invisible but enduring. The driver asked him something in Vietnamese. John shook his head gently, unable to answer. His voice caught somewhere between apology and silence. He pressed the flowers closer to his chest. When the car stopped near the riverbank, John stepped out slowly, his knees unsteady, his breath shallow. Before him stretched the waterway wider than he remembered, quieter yet, carrying the same weight of memory. The surface shimmered with light, but beneath it he imagined the residue of decades past, invisible currents that carried ghosts downstream. He walked toward the bank, the earth soft beneath his shoes, and knelt carefully. The flowers trembled in his hands as he released them one by one onto the water. They floated gently at first, then drifted, forming a trail that moved away from him as if leading toward the horizon. John's eyes blurred with tears he did not wipe away. In that silence he heard again the boy's cough, the child's eyes staring back at him. He whispered, not to be forgiven, but to be heard. I remember. I will not forget you. The river carried the flowers away, and with them a part of the burden he had carried for half a century. Yet the weight was not gone. It would never be gone. This was only the beginning, the opening of a wound he had kept closed too long. Behind him, distant voices rose, children playing along the opposite bank, their laughter light against the heavy air. John turned his breath, catching. Life had continued here stubbornly, beautifully. The river remembered, but it also gave. He realized he was not here only to mourn, but to face those who had lived with the legacy of what he had left behind. He straightened slowly, leaning on his cane, eyes fixed on the small path leading to the village beyond the trees. His journey was no longer just his own. It belonged to the boy in his memory, to his ailing son across the ocean, to the children whose laughter now echoed along the riverbank. John took a step forward, and then another. The river whispered behind him, and though it did not absolve, it did not reject him either. The village lay beyond the trees, quiet in a way that unsettled John. He had expected something different, noise perhaps, or the hum of machines. Instead, what he found was stillness broken only by the occasional bark of a dog and the distant laughter of children. The air smelled of earth, damp and fertile, carrying none of the acrid bitterness that haunted his memories. Yet, with every breath, he wondered if the soil still remembered, if beneath its green surface lay a poisoned past. John followed the narrow path with his cane tapping softly against the ground. The houses were simple. Their walls patched with years of weather, their roofs stooped as though bowing beneath the weight of memory. Chickens wandered freely, scratching the dirt, and laundry swayed in the humid breeze like muted flags of resilience. Every detail reminded him of photographs he had once seen in intelligence briefings, maps marked with red zones, villages labeled not as homes but as coordinates. Now he walked among them, no longer soldier, no longer young, but carrying the shadows of what his presence once meant. At the end of the lane stood a small wooden house, faded and leaning yet dignified in its survival. On the porch sat an old woman, her hair silver, her face carved with lines not just of age, but of endurance. She looked up as John approached. Her eyes were dark, unreadable, holding a depth that made him falter mid-step. This was his first true encounter, not with an abstract memory or a faceless crowd, but with a living soul who had carried the war into her marrow. He did not know her name yet, but he knew enough she had survived. She had remained. John stopped a respectful distance away. His lips parted, but words failed. Even if he had known the language, what could he have said? The silence stretched between them, heavy and alive, as though the air itself resisted, bridging the gap. From inside the house came a sound, low, uneven breathing, followed by a soft thud, as if someone had shifted with difficulty. A young man emerged, his body frail, his steps uncertain. His limbs bore the unmistakable signs of deformity. Arms too thin, a gait unsteady, a stiffness in movement that spoke of pain carried since birth. He lowered himself onto a wooden chair beside the woman, his head tilted slightly, eyes wandering without full focus. John's heart tightened. He had read about such children, children of the soil, children of the chemicals born decades after the war, yet carrying its venom in their blood. He had seen photographs and articles, reports that the government never admitted aloud. But to see him now breathing in the same air, existing not as an image, but as a presence, it was unbearable. The old woman, the grandmother, perhaps rested her hand gently on the young man's shoulder. Her gaze never left John. There was no spoken accusation, yet none was needed. In her silence, John heard the echo of every sin he had tried to bury. Then, from the corner of the porch, a little girl appeared. She could not have been more than 7, her hair tied into 2 small braids, her eyes wide with curiosity rather than judgment. She carried a small sketchbook and a stub of a pencil clutched tightly as though it were treasure. She looked from her grandmother to John, then back again, her brows furrowing with questions unasked. Finally, she sat cross-legged on the steps, opening her book and beginning to draw as though the presence of a foreign old man was simply another subject to capture. John felt the sting of tears, unbidden and unrelenting. It was the innocence of the child that undid him. How could there be laughter here, drawings and play, when the soil still bore scars? How could life insist on blooming, when the river had once carried poison? He wanted to speak, to say his name, to say, "I was here once, and I hurt you without ever knowing who you were." But the words tangled and collapsed before they reached his tongue. Instead, he lowered his head, holding his cane with both hands as though it might anchor him. The silence stretched longer. Behind it, the soft scratching of pencil against paper became the only sound, fragile, yet insistent. The girl drew lines erased, then drew again, her concentration pure. For a moment, John envied her the ability to see and capture without judgment, to translate the world into shapes and lines rather than wounds and regrets. The old woman spoke then, her voice low, steady, a language John could not follow. Yet he felt the weight of her tone, the cadence of words shaped by years of endurance. It was neither welcome nor dismissal. It was recognition. Recognition of a presence she perhaps never thought she would see again. John tried to answer. His voice cracked the English syllables hollow in the air. I'm sorry." The words fell uselessly incomprehensible, swallowed by the gulf of language. Yet, perhaps he thought apology was not meant to be heard. It was meant to be lived. A figure approached along the path, a young man carrying a satchel slung over his shoulder, his steps brisk and confident. He paused upon reaching the house, bowing slightly to the old woman before turning to John with a cautious smile. In careful English, tinged with the cadence of Vietnamese, he said, "She asks who you are." Relief and dread collided in John's chest. He gave his name, his voice trembling, his story condensed into fragments, American soldier long ago. The young man, Min, he introduced himself, translated in hushed tones. The old woman's expression did not change, but her hand tightened on her son's shoulder. The young man beside her, the one marked by illness, stared blankly into the distance as though lost in a fog John himself had conjured. The child continued drawing, oblivious to the tension thickening around her. John's confession was incomplete. It would take time to unearth it all. For now it was enough that the walls had cracked, that he had stood before them not as a stranger, but as a shadow returned. The river's voice seemed to echo in the distance, a reminder that the encounter was only the beginning. The silence, heavy and unresolved, was itself an answer. He had been seen, and he had not been turned away. Not yet. Night in the village was not the same as night in America. In Virginia, silence was broken by the hum of distant traffic, the drone of appliances, the faint glow of street lamps. Here it was darker, fuller, the kind of night that pressed close against the skin. Insects hummed endlessly, and the river spoke in murmurs that carried into the wooden house. John lay on a mat, his body aching from travel lungs, crackling with each breath. Sleep eluded him as it always had, but here it was not only the nightmares that kept him awake, it was the weight of eyes that had measured him earlier that day. The old woman's unflinching gaze, the broken body of her son, the innocent sketching of the little girl. Each image layered upon the boy from his memory, the one who had watched him on the riverbank so many decades ago. They merged, indistinguishable, a chorus of witnesses he could not silence. He rose slowly, joints protesting, and moved outside. The night air was heavy, carrying the scent of damp earth and smoke from a dying fire. He sat on a low stool and stared into the darkness, waiting. He had lived too long with silence, too long with words locked behind fear and shame. Tonight he felt the edge of collapse, and perhaps collapse was what he needed. Min appeared, the young man with the satchel who had helped bridge their languages. He had been invited to stay by the family, perhaps sensing that John's presence required a mediator. Min's eyes were curious but not hostile. He carried both the freshness of youth and the burden of history. John's voice cracked when he began, low and uncertain. "I need to tell it, even if it changes nothing." Min nodded slowly, taking a seat near him. "Speak. I will listen. I will help them hear you." And so John opened the vault of his memory. He spoke of the orders the missions drawn in sterile maps by officers who never touched the soil. He described the day his unit was told to spray along the river to clear vegetation to deny the enemy cover. He had not questioned it then. Soldiers were not meant to question. They were meant to obey. But he remembered the way the liquid hissed from the tanks, turning the air into a poisonous mist. He remembered the villagers scattering, coughing, their skin shining with dew that was not water. He remembered trees blackening within days, fields collapsing into barren stretches. And, always, the children's small figures clutching their mothers, their cries echoing above the mechanical roar. His voice trembled as he confessed the detail that had haunted him most, the boy, the one who did not run, who stood at the riverbank, eyes unflinching as if daring John to see what he was doing. That stare had followed him across 50 years, sitting at the edge of every hospital bed, every sleepless night. John's words faltered, but he pushed through. He told of his return to America, the parades that celebrated soldiers, the medals polished and displayed. None of it touched the rot inside him. The war had ended on paper, but inside he was still at the riverbank, still holding the spray, still watching the boy's eyes. Then came the final blow of confession, his son. The boy he had raised with trembling hands, the boy who had carried his laughter and his smile. His son, who had collapsed one autumn afternoon, who had been diagnosed with leukemia. Doctors spoke of cells, mutations, treatments. John heard only one word: punishment. He believed it was the river's revenge, the child's stare turned into a curse that traveled through his own bloodline. He watched his son wither beneath fluorescent hospital lights, pale as ash eyes losing light day by day. John choked on the memory, his hands gripping his knees until his knuckles whitened. "I gave death to others, and death found my own. There is no balance. There is no justice. There is only the weight." Min's face was pale in the dim light. He translated softly to the old woman, to the young man beside her, though his voice carried tremors. The words hung in the air, thick and unbearable. The old woman listened, her expression unreadable, her hand never leaving her son's shoulder. The young man, Tuan, shifted slightly, his body awkward but determined, as though responding to something deep within the silence. The little girl, Mai, peered up from her sketchbook, sensing the heaviness but not yet understanding. John buried his face in his hands. For the first time in decades, he did not hold the tears back. They came in waves, racking his body, cracking his voice into broken sounds. He wept for the boy at the river, for the children born broken, for his own son lying in sterile sheets. He wept for the poison that still ran in his blood, for the orders he had followed, for the silence he had carried too long. When his sobs subsided, the night pressed in again, thick with the sound of insects and water. No one rushed to comfort him. No one offered forgiveness. The silence itself was the answer. He had spoken, and now he had to live with the echo. The old woman finally spoke, her words slow, deliberate. Min translated, "The river does not forget. The land does not forget. But we are still here." It was not absolution. It was not condemnation. It was truth. John felt the hollowness in his chest deepen, but beneath it stirred a strange clarity. He had unburdened the unspeakable. It had not freed him, but it had revealed the path forward. His journey was no longer about asking for forgiveness. It was about carrying the truth into light, about refusing silence any longer. The night stretched heavy but alive, as though the very air had shifted. John sat trembling, emptied but raw, staring into the darkness. The confession had broken him, but in the breaking there was the first glimmer of something else. Not redemption, not peace, but the fragile seed of resolve. Morning arrived, heavy with humidity, the kind that clung to the skin before the sun even rose above the trees. John sat on the porch of the wooden house, his hands folded over his keen eyes fixed on the river beyond. He had spoken the night before, spilled the truths he had carried like stones in his chest, and though his voice still trembled from the weight of it, silence had answered him. But silence did not last. Word traveled quickly in small places. By dawn, neighbors had begun to appear, drawn by whispers of the American soldier who had returned. They came quietly at first, figures at the edge of the lane, curious but cautious. Then they gathered closer, voices rising in questions, in fragments of anger, in disbelief that a man who once carried poison in his hands now sat among them. John felt their stares before he truly saw them. Eyes, sharp, narrowed, filled with the weight of stories passed down across decades. Some were elders who had lived through the years of war, who remembered the haze that settled over their crops, the sudden sickness that followed. Others were younger, born long after, but carrying scars nonetheless in the twisted limbs of a sibling and the fragile health of a child. The war had never ended for them either. It had seeped into their blood, their homes, their lineage. Min stood at John's side, his posture tense, his satchel hanging heavily across his shoulder. He exchanged hurried words with the villagers, translating fragments for John, though much was clear without words. They want to know why you are here. They want to know what you want. Some want you gone. The old woman, Balan, remained seated, her face carved into stone. Beside her, Antoine shifted uncomfortably, his twisted limbs resisting his effort to sit upright. Little Mai sat cross-legged on the porch, her pencil scratching furiously across paper, capturing what she saw: the crowd, the old soldier, the rising storm of voices. John lowered his gaze. He could not blame them. He had come as a trespasser, carrying nothing but flowers and memories, and now stood face to face with the descendants of those whose soil had been poisoned by his obedience. Their words, though he did not understand them fully, carried the sharp edge of accusation. A woman from the crowd pushed forward, holding the hand of a boy whose skin was pale, his body frail. She pointed toward John, her voice breaking into sharp syllables. Min's translation came quietly. Her son is sick. She believes it is because of what was sprayed. John's chest constricted. The boy's eyes were hollow dark with exhaustion. He saw his own son in that child's face, pale beneath hospital lights, a body fighting a war it had never chosen. For a moment the world tilted, and John felt himself sinking. The crowd grew louder. Some pointed at him. Others shook their heads, voices clashing. Words rose like smoke, heated, uncontainable. Min translated in fragments, his voice strained. They say you cannot erase what was done. They say no apology is enough. They say... He hesitated, his throat tightening. They say you should leave. John felt the weight of those words press against his chest, heavier than the medals once pinned to his uniform. Leave. Perhaps that was what he should have done from the beginning, left the past buried, left the river unvisited, left the ghosts undisturbed. But he had come here because silence had become unbearable, because the ghosts had followed him across oceans. He wanted to stand, to speak, to tell them he carried their pain within his own body, within the fragile bones of his son. But words seemed small, powerless against generations of hurt. The tension swelled until it seemed the air itself might break. And then, amidst the storm, a fragile voice cut through. It was Mai. She lifted her sketchbook high, her small hands trembling under its weight. The page revealed a drawing, the river stretching wide, flowers floating gently, and on the shore 2 figures, one old and bent, one young and straight, standing side by side. Her pencil lines were clumsy but earnest, her vision of a world not divided by past sins but joined by presence. The crowd quieted for a moment, startled by the child's interruption. Eyes turned toward the sketch, toward the innocence that dared to suggest something beyond bitterness. John's throat closed. He felt tears prick at his eyes, not from relief, but from the fragile mercy of a child who did not yet carry the full weight of history. He bowed his head, pressing a hand against his chest as if to hold his breaking heart inside. Ba Lun's gaze softened almost imperceptibly. She spoke, her voice steady but gentler than before. Min translated, "We do not forget. We do not forgive easily. But perhaps you can stay. It was not welcome. It was not acceptance. It was permission to remain for now." John nodded, unable to form words. His entire body trembled with the force of restrained emotion. He felt both exiled and tethered, unwanted, yet bound to the place more deeply than ever before. As the crowd dispersed, murmurs fading into the distance, John remained on the porch, his body heavy, his spirit raw. He had seen the truth of their anger, the living legacy of choices made by young men under orders they barely understood. The past had not dissolved into history books. It lived here in twisted limbs, in fragile lungs, in bitterness that simmered like heat under the skin. The resistance he had faced was not cruelty, it was honesty. And honesty was more unbearable than silence. When the last villager left, night settled once more. John sat motionless, his mind replaying the voices, the faces the frail boy pointed toward him like an accusation carved into flesh. He understood now that this journey would not offer absolution. It would demand something else: endurance, humility, and a willingness to stand in the fire of their truth. Behind him, Mai returned to her sketchbook, drawing another page. This time, she drew the river again, but with more flowers, more color, as though insisting that beauty could still float above poisoned waters. John closed his eyes. The resistance had burned him, but beneath the ashes lay the faint glimmer of resolve. He would not leave. Not yet. Morning returned with the weight of damp air and the hush of early light sliding between leaves. The village stirred in small motions, the rake of a broom over packed earth, the creak of a bicycle rolling past, the distant thud of a mortar and pestle, turning spices to powder. John rose to these ordinary sounds as if to a benediction, surprised by the gentleness of them. Surprised that the world could sound so tender after the day before. He moved carefully as if the boards beneath his feet might object to his presence. The porch had become a kind of threshold between what he had confessed and what he had still to learn, between the resistance of the village and whatever came next. He found the old woman already awake, seated where she had been the night of his confession, her hands folded in her lap with the patience of someone who had outlasted many storms. The young man, Antoine, leaned against the doorframe, his body held together by will, more than strength, eyes turned toward the river as if listening for a memory. A kettle hissed somewhere inside. The little girl appeared with the clatter of cups balanced in two careful hands, a narrow ribbon of steam rising like a ghost that did not frighten anyone anymore. She placed a cup near John and another beside the old woman, then carried the rest inside, returning with a small plate of fruit, its colors bright and improbable against the worn wood, the kind of brightness that insists on being seen no matter how much history would try to dim it. Min arrived soon after, as he had promised, his satchel slung over his shoulder, his breath a little quick as if he had walked faster than usual. He acknowledged them all with a nod and took a quiet place on the step. The old woman spoke, and he listened, thumb pressed to his lower lip in habit. Then he turned to John. "She says there is work today," he explained softly, "if you wish to come. She will not ask you to lift more than you can. There is a fence near the water damaged after the last storm, and the net for drying rice needs mending. Work." The word felt to John like a bridge lowered across a narrow, frightening span. He nodded. His body would protest. He felt the complaint already beginning in his lungs, the way breath sometimes rattled as if passing through winter branches. But he wanted to go. He wanted to place his hands where they could be of use, to let them learn a new shape. They walked the footpath in a small procession, not quite together but no longer strangers, flung apart by the wind. The ground was muddy in places where the river had risen and then retreated. The earth seemed to be practicing learning how to yield and hold at once. At the fence, the damage was plain, a line of posts bent at odd angles, wire, slack as a tired arm. The net was stretched between two poles like a thin, sun-bleached sail, its edges frayed. A small group of neighbors had gathered. No one stared openly at John, though he felt their attention like sunlight on the back of the neck. They gave him no instructions at first. A moment passed in which everyone considered how to begin. Then the old woman stooped, picked up the length of wire, and placed it gently in John's hands. It was such a small gesture, yet it hollowed him with its kindness. He gripped the wire as if taking an oath. Men stood nearby, offering quiet explanations in case the work asked for more than gesture could communicate, but the tasks were simple enough to be translatable without speech. They worked alongside one another, fingers learning knots and turns, bodies drawing close and then apart again in a rhythm older than language. Time lengthened and softened. A dog barked twice and then forgot why. Somewhere a radio hummed a song about a road and a promise. When John's breath grew short, no one made a show of noticing. The old woman touched his elbow once briefly, and in that touch he felt a permission to stand still, to let the air come to be an old man doing what he could. He learned the bend of the wire, the stubbornness of knots that remembered rain, the way a fence can hold not just a field, but the feeling that a place is protected, that it will not be taken again. When the fence was finally straight and the net's edges mended, the work turned to small repairs and then to rest. A jug of water passed from hand to hand, cool and miraculous leaves floating near the rim like tiny obedient boats. The little girl, Mai, sat cross-legged at the edge of the path with her sketchbook, drawing the fence into a line of patient posts. She added the net, the river a small figure with a cane set near the others with no special lighting or halo. It made John ache in a new way, the ache of being placed among, not apart from. At midday, they returned to the house for a meal. It was simple. A constellation of bowls set like modest stars, rice greens bright as fields after rain, fish prepared with a care that honored the fish as much as the guests. The first time John tried to hold the rice with chopsticks, his grip faltered and the grains fell away, the loss comic in its inevitability. He laughed quietly, helplessly, and the others smiled without mockery, as if they had been waiting for laughter to return. The second attempt succeeded. He lifted food to his mouth and tasted not only salt and spice, but the rare sweetness of being taught without being judged. Between mouthfuls, stories found their way to the table. They did not tumble out. They settled in like birds, remembering safe branches. John listened to the old woman's voice, soft sometimes, hitching through Min's careful translation. She spoke of seasons in which the rice would not grow, of years when the bees were fewer, of the quiet terror of holding your breath without knowing you were doing it. She told of women who had waited and then waited more, whose husbands had come back altered or had not come back at all. She did not speak of the day the sky fell in chemicals. She had no need to. The silence around it had the shape of something everyone already knew. John did not offer explanations or apologies, now worn thin at the edges. He offered listening. And when they asked what the war had done to him, he answered simply that he had been given orders and a uniform, but the war had entered him like a seed that grew thorn and root years after he left the field. He said that when his son fell ill, those thorns began to flower. He said there were days he believed he was being asked to feel in his own house, in his own blood, the consequences of not knowing what it truly meant to touch another country's soil with harm. The old woman held her cup with both hands. The river remembers, she said, and though the words came in Vietnamese, John understood them now, perhaps more than he understood himself. Min did not translate. There was no need. In the afternoon they visited a house at the edge of the village. A grandmother waited there with a child whose legs did not straighten, whose hands flapped softly in the air as if trying to stir something into existence. The child laughed, and then did not, eyes flickering as if between two rooms. John stood at the threshold with his hat in his hands, a necessary humility. He did not step across until the grandmother nodded. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of soap. A calendar on the wall marked days no one quite trusted. He brought small things he could offer: a packet of tea buried at the bottom of his bag, a photograph of his own town's river, a notebook he hoped the child might like to draw in. The child pressed a palm against the photograph, then set it down and touched John's sleeve, brief as a moth's wing. It was the lightest touch John had ever felt, and the heaviest. He remembered the boy at the water's edge in his memory, and for a moment the two seemed to meet the child who had watched him poison the river. The child who could not speak now, but spoke with a hand that did not judge. They visited others. A teenager whose breath often ran out as if a thief lived in his lungs. A mother whose face looked older when she was turned away and younger when she smiled straight on. Each house had its version of the same silence, and each welcomed him with a small nod that meant, "You may come in." And also, "We are not sure yet what you mean to us." In the evenings, John wrote. He sat on the porch with a cheap pen and a notebook that had not expected such work, and he wrote what he had seen. Not his interpretations, not his excuses. He wrote what lay before him like a map of an old wound. Fences repaired, nets mended, children who slept like birds with one eye open. Min sat sometimes beside him, reading over his shoulder, suggesting the names of plants so they would not go unrecorded, pointing to words that perhaps needed to be simpler, more true. "You will send this to someone?" Min asked once. "I will carry it to many someones," John said, surprised at the certainty in his voice. "To those who would prefer not to know. To those who knew and forgot. To myself, when I am tempted to be comfortable." Min nodded, as if this answer fit into a space he had been keeping ready. On the third evening, the old woman placed a folded cloth on the porch rail. When John opened it, he found flowers, paper ones, carefully twisted and dyed, sturdy enough to survive a river's temper. The little girl had made them. Some were perfect. Others had corners that refused to obey. John felt a welling in his chest, so sudden he had to look away. "She makes them for the ceremony," Min said. "For when the river is asked to carry memory in a way that does not drown us." When John asked, though he suspected the answer. "Soon," Min said. "When you are ready. When we are." The night before the ceremony, John walked to the river alone. The sky had a soft, bruised color, the early evening kind that promised a cooler wind and then changed its mind. He stood at the bank and watched the water take small secrets downstream. Leaves, a stray flower petal, a boy's paper boat gone limp and then revived. He thought of the first time he stood here, how the air had tasted then, like a hard truth no one wanted to pronounce, how the work of his hands had ruined what his eyes could not yet love. He thought of the fence now strong, of the net mended, of cups shared over simple meals, of a child whose drawing placed him inside the picture without apology. He did not ask the river for absolution. He did not believe in such things anymore, not as he once had. He asked only for strength, the kind that would let him stand in the heat of others' truth, without flinching, the kind that would let him carry stories like water and not spill them by clumsy carelessness. He asked to remember that a bridge is not built in a day, nor alone, nor for a single person to walk across and claim as his. He slept lightly and woke with his breath rattling a little more than usual. The old woman noticed and brought a small cup of something bitter that cleared the fog from his chest long enough to sit upright without effort. He took it with both hands, sat in gratitude with the taste, and watched the little girl arrange the paper flowers in a shallow basket, counting them in a whisper she did not need him to understand. When the sun lowered itself toward the line of trees and the heat eased a fraction, the village began to gather by the river. Not all came. Some watched from doorways. Some stayed away entirely. Those who arrived did so with the kind of quiet that accompanies work more than celebration. The baskets were set near the bank, and an older man raised his hands, palms outward, speaking words that John felt in his chest as a steady drum rather than heard with his ears as sentences. The words were about remembering, and not drowning, about letting the river carry what human hearts could not hold alone, about looking at each other without mistaking one another for the past. The old woman lifted the first basket. She did not look at John, but she stepped closer to him enough that even without touch he felt the proximity as a blessing granted cautiously, conditionally, and nonetheless granted. Antoine stood beside her, swaying slightly, his rib cage rising like a bird gathering courage. The little girl held the edge of the basket with both hands. Min's shoulder brushed John's, an accidental contact that felt like a rope passed from one person to another across a dark place. They would release the flowers soon. The river would take them. The ceremony would do what ceremonies can do, Gather grief into a shape and ask water to bear it farther than human arms can carry. John closed his eyes. He saw his son. He saw the boy at the river long ago, still unblinking. He saw fences, nets, cups set on a low table, a drawing of two figures standing side by side without heroics. He breathed. Somewhere in the theater of his mind, a quiet voice, his own and not his own, spoke to anyone within earshot across time. If you believe in stories that mend what history tears, if you believe in listening as a form of courage, keep walking with us to the end. Subscribe in spirit and in truth to the work of remembering and making whole. If this journey speaks to you, please consider subscribing to our healing channel so these testimonies of courage and compassion continue to be told. The river waited. The baskets were lifted. The first flowers leaned toward water the way tired people lean toward sleep. The bridge had not disappeared the distance, but it had made a path. Tomorrow they would test it together. The river gathered them at dusk. It was not a loud gathering. It was not meant for spectacle. It was a quiet procession of neighbors and kin, of those who had lived with silence and those who had been born into scars. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth, with the hush of birds folding themselves into evening. Shadows lengthened across the water, and the current shimmered like an endless sheet of memory. John stood among them, the basket of paper flowers cradled carefully in his arms. His hands shook not from age alone, but from the enormity of the moment. Around him, villagers carried their own baskets, each filled with fragile blooms, each one folded with care by hands that had endured too much. The ceremony was not new to them. It had been done many times before. But tonight he was here, and that changed its weight. The old woman, Baalan, stepped forward first, her movement steady, though her bones carried decades of grief. Beside her, Antoine leaned into the support of a wooden stick, his body trembling but resolute. Little Mai clutched the edge of a basket almost too heavy for her, her face bright with the seriousness of a child who knew this was not play, but something sacred. Min hovered close, ready to translate if needed, though words felt smaller than the moment. The elder of the village lifted his arms and spoke in low tones. His words rolled like the river itself, deep, unhurried, carrying more weight than sound alone. John did not understand the language, but he understood the cadence. It was about remembering, about carrying grief, not as a stone, but as a current, about letting water hold what human hearts could not. When the words ended, silence filled the space, and all eyes turned toward the river. Baalan placed the first flower on the surface. It wavered, then caught the current and drifted away, spinning once as if in acknowledgement. Others followed each bloom, a name, a memory, a wound entrusted to water. The river took them without protest, without judgment, carrying them gently into its endless body. John's turn came. He knelt at the bank, his knees pressing into the soil he once feared to touch. He held one flower in his palm, its folds delicate yet strong. He whispered, not in prayer, not in plea for forgiveness, but in confession, renewed. I remember you. I will carry you. I will not let silence bury you again. He placed the flower on the water. It joined the others drifting downstream, a fragile constellation of memory set afloat. His chest tightened, but this time the tears came not as punishment, but as release. They carved lines down his face, furrows of surrender, furrows of something he had not dared to name. Hope. The ceremony continued until the river was a trail of white, the blooms forming a luminous path across the darkening surface. The villagers stood in silence, eyes fixed on the water, some with tears, others with faces carved still as stone. For a moment they were not divided by language, by history, by wound or blame. For a moment they were one body standing at the edge of something larger, watching memory move. When the last basket was emptied, the elder bowed his head. The people followed, and then they slowly turned back toward the village, leaving the flowers to drift into the unknown. But John remained. He stayed by the river long after the others had gone, long after the air grew cooler, and the first stars blinked into being. Min lingered beside him silent, giving him the gift of presence. John's eyes followed the flowers until they blurred into the dark, until they became less petals and more prayer, At last, he spoke. "This is not an ending. It cannot be." His voice cracked but steadied with the weight of resolve. "I will write this. I will speak this. I will tell the truth not for absolution, but because truth is owed to the living." Min nodded. "Then you are not alone." John turned back toward the path, his steps unsteady but driven. He knew now what the rest of his life would hold. Not comfort, not peace, but labor of memory. Labor of voice, labor of carrying forward the names of those lost and the faces of those who still bore the mark of what he once helped unleash. As they neared the house, little Mai ran to him, thrusting her sketchbook into his hands. On the page was a new drawing, the river filled with flowers, stars above it, and among the villagers stood a figure with a cane, small but unmistakable. He was not a part. He was inside the picture. John's hands trembled as he closed the book gently. "Thank you," he whispered, though he knew she would not understand the words. Perhaps she did not need to. That night before sleep claimed him, he began to write again. His words were not polished. They stumbled and fell, but they were alive. He wrote for his son, for the boy at the river's edge, for Mai's sketchbook, for the flowers now far downstream. He wrote so the silence would not win. In the weeks that followed, John returned to America. His body weakened, but his voice grew stronger. He spoke in small gatherings in churches and community halls. He showed photographs of the river of paper flowers drifting under starlight. He carried Mai's drawing folded in his pocket like a sacred text. People listened. Some turned away, but enough stayed. Enough leaned forward with tears and with questions. Remember, John told them, his voice rough but unwavering. The war did not end when the guns fell silent. It continues in the blood of children, in the breath of mothers, in the rivers that still carry memory. To forget is to wound again. He paused, his gaze sweeping the faces before him. And if you believe in the power of telling these truths, if you believe in healing across distance, then stay with me. Subscribe not just to a channel, but to the work of remembering, to the courage of listening. Stay, so these voices are never lost. Months later, when his strength faltered further, he recorded his memories, his voice rasping but resolute. "If you hear me," he said into the quiet of a microphone, "know that rivers do not forget, but rivers also carry forward. Let us be like the river holding memory, but always moving, always carrying light downstream." His message ended as softly as it began, with the sound of pages turning, with the breath of an old man who had finally spoken. And in that final breath, in the silence that followed, a last invitation lingered. Subscribe to the journey of healing, so that even when voices fade, the truth will not. Subscribe because remembrance is the bridge between us.